September 1980, Columbus, Ohio. 14-year-old Jennifer Wyant kissed her parents goodbye and stepped into the evening air for what should have been a simple walk around her East Side neighborhood. She was bright, hopeful, loved by everyone who knew her. But Jennifer never came home. What followed was every parent's worst nightmare. Search parties with flashlights, missing person posters on every corner, a community holding its breath. Then, days later, the devastating discovery that shattered a family and haunted a city. For 30 years, Jennifer's killer walked free. The evidence sat silent in storage, waiting for science to catch up with justice. DNA technology that didn't exist in 1980 would eventually point to one man, Johnnie Earl Young, a man who had been hiding in plain sight for 3 decades. But here's what will shock you most about this case. How did he avoid suspicion for so long, and what finally brought him down? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The autumn air carried a chill through Columbus, Ohio, on September 20, 1980. Jennifer Wyant, just 14 years old, stood in the doorway of her family's modest home on the east side of the city. Her dark hair caught the last rays of sunlight as she turned to wave goodbye to her parents. "I'll be back soon," she called out, her voice carrying the easy confidence of a teenager who had walked these familiar streets countless times before. Her parents smiled and waved back, watching their daughter disappear around the corner. It was a scene played out in thousands of homes across America every day. Ordinary, safe, routine. But this time was different. Hours passed. The sun set. The family gathered for dinner, but Jennifer's chair remained empty. Her parents glanced at the clock, then at each other. Their daughter was never late. She was responsible, trustworthy, always kept her word about when she'd return. By 9 o'clock, worry had transformed into panic. Jennifer's father grabbed a flashlight and began walking the neighborhood, calling her name. Her mother stayed by the phone, calling Jennifer's friends, her voice growing more strained with each conversation. No one had seen her. No one knew where she might be. The Columbus Police Department received the missing person report just after 10 o'clock that night. Officer Martinez took the call, listening to the desperate voice of Jennifer's father describing his daughter. 5 feet tall, brown hair, wearing jeans and a light jacket. Last seen walking near East Broad Street. Within an hour, patrol cars were cruising the east side of Columbus with searchlights cutting through the darkness. The Wyant family's telephone rang constantly as word spread through their close-knit community. Neighbors emerged from their homes with flashlights, forming impromptu search parties that would comb the streets until dawn. The first night yielded nothing but growing dread. As the sun rose on September 21, the search intensified. Local television stations picked up the story. Jennifer's photograph appeared on morning news broadcasts, accompanied by her parents' tearful pleas for information. The family's phone rang constantly with tips, sightings, and offers of help. Volunteers arrived at the Wyant home by the dozens. Church groups organized systematic searches of parks and wooded areas. Local businesses printed thousands of missing person flyers. Jennifer's face looked out from telephone poles, store windows, and community bulletin boards across Columbus. Detective Sarah Chen of the Columbus Police Department's Missing Persons Unit took over the case on the second day. She had 15 years of experience, but Jennifer Wyant's disappearance felt different. The girl's routine was predictable. Her family relationships were strong. There were no obvious explanations for her absence. Chen interviewed Jennifer's closest friends, teachers, neighbors. Everyone described the same person, a bright, responsible teenager who loved school, helped her younger siblings with homework, and dreamed of becoming a teacher herself. She had no enemies, no secret relationships, no history of running away. By the third day, the search had expanded to include wooded areas outside the city limits. Ohio State Highway Patrol joined the effort, along with volunteer search and rescue teams from across central Ohio. Helicopters circled overhead while ground teams walked through brush and creek beds, hoping to find any trace of Jennifer. The media coverage intensified. Jennifer's story led local newscasts and appeared in newspapers throughout Ohio. Her parents made emotional appeals on television, begging for their daughter's safe return. The community rallied around the family, providing meals, organizing searches, and offering support in any way possible. But with each passing day, hope faded. Detective Chen knew the statistics. The longer a person remained missing, especially a young person, the less likely they were to return home alive. She kept this knowledge to herself while maintaining an outward appearance of optimism for the family's sake. On September 24, 4 days after Jennifer's disappearance, a jogger running through a wooded area on the south side of Columbus made a discovery that would shatter any remaining hope. Hidden in a grove of trees, partially concealed by fallen leaves, was the body of a young girl. The call came into police dispatch at 7:23 a.m. Within minutes, Detective Chen and a team of crime scene investigators were racing toward the location. As they approached the scene, Chen felt the familiar knot in her stomach that came with the worst part of her job. The victim had been deceased for several days. The body was positioned in a way that suggested the location was not where the crime had occurred, but rather where the perpetrator had chosen to conceal evidence of their actions. Crime scene photographer Rebecca Walsh documented everything with methodical precision, while forensic specialists began the careful process of collecting evidence. The medical examiner's preliminary assessment confirmed what Detective Chen feared most. The victim had died from violent trauma. This was not an accident or a case of someone getting lost in the woods. This was murder. Dental records confirmed what the family already knew in their hearts. The body found in the woods was Jennifer Wyant. The bright, hopeful 14-year-old who had kissed her parents goodbye 4 days earlier would never come home again. The notification was the hardest part of Detective Chen's career. She had delivered terrible news to families before, but something about Jennifer's case felt especially cruel. The girl's parents had maintained such faith that their daughter would return safely. Destroying that faith felt like committing a crime itself. The Wyant family's world collapsed in that moment. Jennifer's mother fell to her knees in the living room, her anguished cries echoing through the house. Her father stood frozen, unable to process the words he had just heard. Jennifer's younger siblings, sensing the gravity of the moment, began to cry without fully understanding why. The news of Jennifer's death sent shockwaves through Columbus. A missing person case that had captured the community's attention and sympathy had become something far darker. Parents throughout the city held their children a little tighter that night, reminded of how quickly safety could transform into nightmare. Local television stations interrupted regular programming to report the discovery. Jennifer's school held a moment of silence. Churches throughout Columbus announced special services to pray for the Wyant family and mourn the loss of an innocent life. Detective Chen knew that the real work was just beginning. A murder investigation required a different approach than a missing person case. The crime scene had yielded biological evidence that would be crucial to identifying Jennifer's killer, but forensic science in 1980 was limited compared to what would be possible decades later. The evidence collected from the scene was carefully cataloged and preserved. Hair fibers, tissue samples, and other biological material were stored according to strict protocols, though the technology to fully analyze them would not exist for years to come. Detective Chen made sure everything was properly documented, hoping that someday science would provide the answers that 1980s investigative techniques could not. The funeral service for Jennifer Wyant was held on September 28, 1980, at St. Mary's Catholic Church on Columbus's east side. The sanctuary overflowed with mourners, family, friends, teachers, neighbors, and hundreds of community members who had never met Jennifer but felt compelled to honor her memory. Jennifer's parents, supported by family members, walked slowly down the aisle behind their daughter's small casket. The sight of parents burying their child touched something deep in everyone present. This was not the natural order of things. Children were supposed to outlive their parents, not the other way around. Father Mackenzie, who had baptized Jennifer 14 years earlier, struggled to find words that could provide comfort in the face of such senseless tragedy. He spoke of Jennifer's kindness, her academic achievements, her love for her family. He reminded the congregation that while her life had been cut short, the impact she had made on those who knew her would endure forever. The hymn seemed to carry extra weight that day. Amazing Grace filled the sanctuary as hundreds of voices joined together in grief and remembrance. Jennifer's classmates, many attending their first funeral, wept openly as they said goodbye to their friend. After the service, a long procession of cars followed the hearse to Greenlawn Cemetery on the west side of Columbus. Jennifer was laid to rest under an oak tree in a quiet section of the cemetery, her gravestone bearing the simple inscription, "Beloved daughter and sister, her light still shines." As family and friends gathered around the grave for final prayers, Detective Chen stood at a respectful distance, watching the faces in the crowd. She had learned over the years that murderers sometimes attended their victims' funerals, drawn by a sick fascination with the grief they had caused. She memorized faces, took notes, and added potential suspects to her growing list. The investigation that followed Jennifer's funeral was thorough but ultimately frustrated by the limitations of 1980s forensic science. Detective Chen and her team interviewed hundreds of people, followed up on dozens of tips, and investigated every possible lead. They compiled extensive files on potential suspects, including men with criminal histories who had been in the Columbus area at the time of Jennifer's murder. One name that appeared in the files was Johnnie Earl Young, a man with a history of violent crimes who had been living in Columbus since September 1980. But without physical evidence connecting him to Jennifer's murder, investigators could only add his name to the growing list of possibilities. By early 1981, the active investigation into Jennifer Wyant's murder had reached a frustrating stalemate. Detective Chen and her team had exhausted every promising lead. The biological evidence collected from the crime scene had been analyzed using every technique available at the time, but the results were inconclusive. DNA analysis, which would revolutionize criminal investigations, was still years away from practical application. The case file grew thick with reports, witness statements, and laboratory results that yielded no definitive answers. Jennifer's murder was officially classified as an open but cold case, joining thousands of similar files in police departments across the country. Detective Chen kept the case on her desk longer than protocol required, unwilling to consign Jennifer's memory to a storage room. For the Wyant family, the transition from active investigation to cold case felt like a second death. The daily phone calls from detectives stopped. The sense of forward momentum that had sustained them through the first months of grief disappeared. They were left alone with their loss, supported by family and friends but ultimately isolated in their pain. The early 1980s brought changes to Columbus and to the families affected by Jennifer's murder. New subdivisions sprouted on the outskirts of the city. Shopping malls drew business away from downtown. The Reagan era brought economic prosperity to some and hardship to others. For the Wyant family, these years were marked by the slow, painful process of learning to live with loss. Birthdays passed without celebration. Christmas mornings were shadowed by an empty stocking that Jennifer's mother couldn't bring herself to put away. Family photographs from this period show forced smiles and eyes that held depths of sadness. Jennifer's younger siblings grew up in the shadow of their sister's memory. They attended the same schools Jennifer had loved, walked the same hallways where her photographs hung in memorial displays. Well-meaning teachers and classmates often reminded them of their loss, making it impossible to escape the tragedy that had defined their family. The community of Columbus gradually moved on, as communities must. New tragedies captured headlines and public attention. Jennifer's story, while not forgotten, faded from daily conversation. Only her family and a few dedicated investigators remembered to mark the anniversaries of her disappearance and death. Detective Chen retired from the Columbus Police Department in 1987, but she kept copies of Jennifer's case files in her home office. She had worked dozens of murder cases during her career, but Jennifer's death haunted her differently than the others. Perhaps it was the girl's age, or the randomness of the crime, or the frustrating lack of resolution that made this case linger in her mind. New detectives inherited Jennifer's file over the years. Each brought fresh perspectives and renewed energy to the investigation. They re-interviewed witnesses, followed up on tips that continued to trickle in, and reviewed the evidence with eyes unclouded by years of frustration. But the fundamental problem remained. Without advances in forensic science, the physical evidence collected in 1980 could not provide the definitive answers needed to solve the case. By the mid-1990s, stories about DNA analysis were beginning to appear in newspapers and on television. The technology that had been used to solve paternity disputes was finding applications in criminal investigation. Cold cases across the country were being reopened as police departments began to understand the potential of genetic evidence. Detective Ray Morrison inherited Jennifer's case in 1998 when he joined the Columbus Police Department's cold case unit. Unlike many of his colleagues, Morrison was fascinated by the emerging field of forensic genetics. He attended seminars, read scientific journals, and built relationships with laboratory technicians who were pioneers in applying DNA analysis to criminal investigations. The late 1990s and early 2000s saw rapid advances in DNA technology. What had been experimental and expensive became routine and affordable. Police departments across Ohio began submitting cold case evidence for genetic analysis, and success stories started making headlines. In 2003, Detective Morrison submitted a formal request to have Jennifer's case evidence re-examined using modern DNA techniques. The biological samples collected in 1980 had been properly preserved, stored in a gray temperature-controlled environment that maintained their integrity over more than 2 decades. If genetic material was present, current technology should be able to extract and analyze it. The process was not quick. Laboratories across the country were backlogged with similar requests from police departments hoping to solve old cases. Jennifer's evidence joined a queue that stretched months into the future. Detective Morrison updated the Wyant family on the developments, carefully managing their expectations while sharing their renewed hope. Jennifer's parents, now in their 60s, had lived more than half their lives without their daughter. They had buried other family members, seen their surviving children graduate from school and start families of their own, and found ways to construct meaningful lives around the permanent hole left by Jennifer's absence. The possibility of finally getting answers was both thrilling and terrifying. In late 2004, Jennifer's evidence finally reached the front of the laboratory queue. Forensic scientist Dr. Patricia Reeves, who specialized in cold case DNA analysis, personally handled the samples. She understood that each test tube and evidence envelope represented not just scientific data, but families who had waited years or decades for answers. Dr. Reeves extracted genetic material from biological samples collected at Jennifer's crime scene in 1980. The DNA was degraded after nearly 25 years, but modern techniques could work with far less material than had been required in the early days of genetic analysis. Step by step, she built a genetic profile from the evidence. The next phase involved comparing Jennifer's case profile against databases of known offenders. The Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, maintained by the FBI, contained genetic profiles from hundreds of thousands of convicted criminals across the United States. If Jennifer's killer had been arrested for another crime and submitted a DNA sample, the database would reveal his identity. For several days, computers ran comparisons between Jennifer's case evidence and thousands of profiles in the system. Detective Morrison waited anxiously for results, knowing that a positive match would transform the cold case into an active investigation with a named suspect. The call came on December 15, 2004. Dr. Reeves contacted Detective Morrison with news that would change everything. The DNA profile from Jennifer's case evidence matched a sample in the CODIS database. The match was to Johnnie Earl Young, a man with a lengthy criminal history who had been required to submit a DNA sample after a conviction for sexual assault. Detective Morrison felt his heart rate increase as he listened to Dr. Reeves explain the statistical certainty of the match. The probability that the DNA came from someone other than Johnnie Earl Young was less than 1 in several billion. After nearly 25 years of uncertainty, science had provided an answer. Morrison immediately began researching Young's background and whereabouts. The man had been in and out of prison for various crimes over the years, but he was currently free and living in Toledo, Ohio. Records showed that in September 1980, Young had indeed been living in Columbus, working construction jobs and staying in a boarding house less than 2 miles from where Jennifer had disappeared. The detective's excitement was tempered by caution. A DNA match was powerful evidence, but building a prosecution case would require careful work. Morrison needed to verify Young's presence in Columbus during the time of Jennifer's murder, establish possible connections between Young and Jennifer, and prepare for the legal challenges that defense attorneys would certainly raise. Detective Morrison spent the final weeks of 2004 building a comprehensive case against Johnnie Earl Young. He reviewed the original 1980 investigation files, noting that Young had been briefly interviewed as part of the broad canvas of potential suspects but had not been considered a primary person of interest. The interview record from 1980 showed that Young had provided an alibi for the night of Jennifer's disappearance, claiming he had been drinking at a local bar with friends who vouched for his presence. In the absence of physical evidence, investigators had moved on to other suspects. Now, DNA evidence suggested that Young had lied about his whereabouts that night. Morrison contacted retired Detective Chen, who was now 73 years old and living in a suburb of Columbus. When he told her about the DNA match, she was silent for a long moment before speaking. "I remember him," she said quietly. "Johnnie Young. Something about him bothered me during that interview, but we had no evidence to hold him. Are you certain about the DNA?" Morrison assured her that the laboratory results were definitive. After nearly 25 years, Jennifer Wyant's killer had been identified. The next step was arrest and prosecution. On January 12, 2005, a team of Columbus police officers and federal marshals surrounded a rundown apartment building in Toledo where Johnnie Earl Young was living. Detective Morrison led the arrest team, carrying with him the weight of 25 years of investigation and the hopes of Jennifer Wyant's family for justice. Young answered his door, wearing a bathrobe and slippers, his gray hair unkempt and his face showing the wear of 6 decades of hard living. When Morrison identified himself and informed Young that he was under arrest for the 1980 murder of Jennifer Wyant, the man's expression showed no surprise, only resignation. "I've been waiting for this day," Young said quietly as the handcuffs clicked into place. "I knew it would catch up to me eventually." The arrest made headlines across Ohio and captured national attention as an example of how DNA technology was solving cold cases that had frustrated investigators for decades. For the Wyant family, Seeing Young's photograph in newspapers and on television was both satisfying and disturbing. This was the face of the man who had destroyed their lives 25 years earlier. The legal proceedings began immediately. Prosecutor Michael Sullivan, who specialized in cold cases, took personal charge of the case against Young. Sullivan had built his reputation on meticulous preparation and clear presentation of complex scientific evidence to juries who might be unfamiliar with DNA analysis. Young's defense attorney, Rebecca Martinez, faced the challenging task of defending a client against what appeared to be overwhelming physical evidence. Martinez was experienced in handling difficult cases, but DNA evidence was nearly impossible to refute when properly collected and analyzed. The prosecution's case was built around the DNA match, Young's presence in Columbus at the time of the murder, and his pattern of violent crimes against young women. Dr. Reeves prepared to testify about the laboratory analysis that had identified Young as Jennifer's killer, while Detective Morrison compiled evidence of Young's activities in 1980. The defense strategy focused on challenging the reliability of DNA evidence collected 25 years earlier and questioning the chain of custody that had preserved the samples over more than 2 decades. Martinez argued that contamination or degradation of the evidence could have produced false results. Jury selection for Young's trial began on September 15, 2005, exactly 25 years after Jennifer's murder. The pool of potential jurors was questioned extensively about their understanding of DNA evidence and their ability to remain impartial in a case that had received significant media coverage. The selected jury consisted of 8 women and 4 men, ranging in age from 25 to 67. Several were parents themselves, which prosecution attorneys hoped would make them sympathetic to the Wyant family's long wait for justice. Defense attorneys worried that parental emotions might override careful consideration of the evidence. Opening statements began on September 20, 2005, the 25th anniversary of Jennifer's disappearance. Prosecutor Sullivan stood before the jury and methodically outlined the case against Young, from Jennifer's disappearance through the DNA analysis that had identified her killer. For 25 years, Jennifer Wyant's family has wondered who took their daughter away from them, Sullivan told the jury. Today, science gives us the answer. The defendant's DNA was found at the crime scene. The evidence will show that Johnnie Earl Young murdered Jennifer Wyant in September 1980. Defense attorney Martinez countered by questioning the reliability of 25-year-old evidence and reminding the jury that DNA analysis, while powerful, was not infallible. She argued that the passage of time had created too many opportunities for contamination or error. The prosecution's presentation of evidence began with testimony from Jennifer's family members, who described her character, her habits, and the devastating impact of her death on their lives. Jennifer's mother, now in her late 60s, took the witness stand and spoke about her daughter with a mixture of love and grief that moved several jurors to tears. Detective Morrison testified about the original 1980 investigation and the decision to preserve biological evidence for future analysis. His detailed presentation of the investigative timeline showed the jury how police had methodically worked the case for 25 years without giving up hope. Dr. Reeves provided the most crucial testimony, explaining in clear, non-technical language how DNA analysis worked and why the results in Jennifer's case were scientifically certain. She walked the jury through each step of the process, from evidence collection to database comparison, making the complex science accessible to ordinary citizens. The DNA evidence was overwhelming. The statistical probability that the biological material came from someone other than Johnnie Earl Young was approximately 1 in 15 billion, effectively impossible given the world's population. The defense's challenges to the evidence appeared weak in comparison to such certainty. Young's criminal history was presented to the jury as evidence of his pattern of violence against women. Over the years, he had been convicted of sexual assault, attempted rape, and aggravated battery. The escalating severity of his crimes painted a picture of a dangerous predator who had eventually committed murder. Defense attorney Martinez fought to exclude much of Young's criminal history, arguing that past convictions were not proof of guilt in Jennifer's case. But the judge allowed the evidence as relevant to establishing Young's propensity for violence and his presence in Columbus during the relevant time period. The defense case was brief and focused primarily on challenging the prosecution's scientific evidence. Martinez called her own DNA expert, who testified that 25-year-old biological samples could produce unreliable results due to degradation and contamination. However, The defense expert was forced to admit under cross-examination that proper storage procedures, such as those used in Jennifer's case, could preserve genetic material for decades. Young himself chose not to testify, exercising his constitutional right to remain silent. His decision eliminated any chance for the jury to hear his side of the story, but it also prevented prosecutors from cross-examining him about his criminal history and his activities. In September 1980, closing arguments began on October 3, 2005. Prosecutor Sullivan reminded the jury of the scientific certainty of the DNA evidence and Young's pattern of violent crimes. He asked them to consider the 25 years of pain endured by Jennifer's family and to deliver the justice that had been delayed for too long. The evidence is clear and overwhelming, Sullivan told the jury. Johnnie Earl Young murdered Jennifer Wyant 25 years ago. Science has given us the proof. Now it's time for justice. Defense attorney Martinez made a final appeal for reasonable doubt, arguing that the passage of time had created too many opportunities for error and contamination of the evidence. She reminded the jury that conviction required proof beyond reasonable doubt, not just scientific probability. The jury began deliberations on October 4, 2005. They requested to review the DNA evidence presentation and asked detailed questions about the laboratory analysis procedures. Their careful attention to the scientific aspects of the case suggested they understood the gravity of their decision. After 8 hours of deliberation spread across 2 days, the jury reached a verdict. Court was reconvened on October 6, 2005, with the Wyant family seated in the front row and Young standing beside his attorneys as the foreman announced the decision. We, the jury, find the defendant Johnnie Earl Young guilty of murder in the first degree. The courtroom erupted in gasps and quiet sobs. Jennifer's mother covered her face with her hands, overwhelmed by emotions she had carried for 25 years. Her father sat motionless, staring at Young with a mixture of satisfaction and lingering anger. Young himself showed no visible reaction to the verdict. He stood calmly as the judge thanked the jury and scheduled sentencing for the following month. Deputies led him away in handcuffs, beginning a process that would result in life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For Detective Morrison, the verdict represented the successful conclusion of the most important case of his career. He had taken Jennifer's file from a dusty storage room and used modern science to identify her killer. Justice had been delayed, but it had not been denied. Sentencing took place on November 15, 2005, in the same courtroom where Young had been convicted. Judge Patricia Williams had presided over hundreds of criminal cases during her career, but few had carried the emotional weight of Jennifer Wyant's murder. Before announcing the sentence, Judge Williams allowed Jennifer's family members to address the court. Her mother stood slowly and walked to the podium, her voice shaking as she spoke about 25 years of grief and the daughter who would never graduate from high school, attend college, or have children of her own. You stole her life, she said, looking directly at Young. You stole her future, and you stole our dreams for her. But today, finally, you will pay for what you did. Judge Williams sentenced Young to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the maximum penalty available under Ohio law for first-degree murder. The sentence ensured that Young, now 65 years old, would spend the remainder of his life behind bars. The evidence in this case demonstrates that you are a dangerous predator who has terrorized women for decades, Judge Williams told Young. This sentence protects society from further harm and provides some measure of justice for Jennifer Wyant and her family. The conclusion of Young's trial marked the end of 25 years of uncertainty for the Wyant family, but it also began a new chapter in their lives. They had lived so long with unanswered questions that resolution felt both satisfying and strange. In interviews after the trial, Jennifer's mother spoke about the mixture of emotions she felt: relief that the killer had been identified and punished, gratitude for the detectives and scientists who had never given up on the case, but also a continuing sense of loss that could never be fully healed. Nothing will bring Jennifer back, she said, but knowing that her killer has been caught gives us some peace. We can finally stop wondering and start healing. The case became a model for other police departments dealing with cold cases. Detective Morrison was invited to speak at conferences about the importance of preserving evidence and the potential of DNA analysis to solve decades-old crimes. Jennifer's story inspired other families to advocate for renewed attention to their own unsolved cases. Dr. Reeves, the forensic scientist whose analysis had identified Young, continued working on cold cases and helped solve dozens of other murders over the following years. She kept Jennifer's case file on her desk as a reminder of the human impact of her scientific work. In the years following Young's conviction, advances in DNA technology continued to accelerate. Cases that had seemed hopeless in 2005 became solvable with new techniques for analyzing degraded or minimal genetic material. Jennifer's case had been among the early successes of cold case DNA analysis, paving the way for thousands of other families to find answers. The Wyant family established a memorial scholarship in Jennifer's name, awarded annually to students who demonstrated the same academic excellence and community spirit that Jennifer had shown during her brief life. The scholarship ensured that Jennifer's memory would continue to inspire young people decades after her death. Columbus installed a memorial garden in Jennifer's honor at the park near her family's home. The garden featured a bench where visitors could sit and remember not just Jennifer, but all victims of violent crime whose lives had been cut short by the actions of others. Young remained in the Ohio State Penitentiary where he was expected to die. He had made no appeals of his conviction and showed no remorse for his crimes. For him, the trial had represented the final accounting for a lifetime of violence against innocent victims. The impact of Jennifer's case extended far beyond Columbus, Ohio. It became part of the national conversation about the potential of forensic science to solve cold cases and provide closure to families who had waited decades for answers. Television programs featured the case as an example of how persistence and technology could overcome seemingly impossible odds. Law enforcement agencies across the country began reviewing their own cold case files, looking for evidence that could be re-examined using modern DNA techniques. Jennifer's case had demonstrated that biological material could remain viable for analysis decades after collection, encouraging departments to preserve evidence even when current technology could not provide answers. The Wyant family's long wait for justice resonated with viewers who had experienced similar tragedies in their own lives. Support groups for families of murder victims cited Jennifer's case as proof that hope should never be abandoned, even when years pass without progress in an investigation. For the community of Columbus, Young's conviction provided a sense of closure to a tragedy that had haunted the city for 25 years. Parents who had restricted their children's activities after Jennifer's murder could finally feel that justice had been served, even if the victory had come at a terrible cost in time and suffering. As the years passed after Young's conviction, the Wyant family found ways to honor Jennifer's memory while building meaningful lives around their loss. Her siblings, now adults with families of their own, made sure their children knew about the aunt they would never meet but whose spirit remained part of their family's story. Jennifer's bedroom, which had been preserved exactly as she left it for many years after her death, was finally converted into a nursery for her first nephew. The transformation was emotional but necessary, representing the family's gradual transition from a state of suspended grief to active remembrance coupled with hope for the future. The annual memorial services held on the anniversary of Jennifer's death evolved from somber gatherings focused on loss to celebrations of her life and legacy. Friends who had known Jennifer as a teenager brought their own children to meet the family, ensuring that new generations would understand the importance of Jennifer's story. Detective Morrison retired from the Columbus Police Department in 2015, 30 years after joining the force. Jennifer's case remained the most significant accomplishment of his career, and he kept a framed photograph of her on his desk until his final day of service. The case had taught him that persistence and scientific progress could overcome even the most challenging obstacles to justice. Dr. Reeves continued her work in forensic genetics, eventually becoming one of the nation's leading experts in cold case DNA analysis. She testified in hundreds of trials and helped solve thousands of cases, but she never forgot that each genetic profile represented a real person whose death had devastated a family. Jennifer's case had been one of her first major successes, setting the standard for the meticulous work that would define her career. The Columbus Police Department's cold case unit expanded significantly in the years following Jennifer's case, inspired by the success of DNA analysis in solving previously unsolvable crimes. Dozens of other families in central Ohio found answers to questions they had carried for years, and many credited Jennifer's case with providing the model for their own pursuit of justice. Young's health deteriorated during his years in prison, and he was eventually transferred to the medical facility at the Ohio State Penitentiary. He maintained his silence about other crimes he might have committed, taking whatever additional secrets he possessed to his grave when he died of natural causes in 2018 at the age of 78. His death was noted in brief newspaper obituaries that focused primarily on his conviction for Jennifer's murder. For the Wyant family, Young's death represented the final chapter in a story that had dominated their lives for nearly 40 years. They felt no satisfaction in his passing, only a quiet recognition that their daughter's killer could no longer harm anyone else. The evolution of DNA technology continued at a rapid pace throughout the 2010s, with new techniques allowing analysis of increasingly degraded or minimal genetic material. Cases that had been considered hopeless even a few years earlier became solvable with improved laboratory methods and expanded databases of genetic profiles. In 2020, 40 years after Jennifer's murder, the Columbus Police Department held a ceremony honoring cold case investigations and the families who had waited decades for justice. Jennifer's case was featured prominently in the program, with speakers noting how her family's patience and the investigators' persistence had created a template for solving similar crimes. Jennifer's parents, now in their 80s, attended the ceremony along with their surviving children and grandchildren. The recognition was meaningful to them, but they emphasized that their primary goal had always been justice for Jennifer, not public acclaim for themselves. The ceremony also honored the scientific advances that had made cold case solutions possible. Representatives from laboratories across Ohio spoke about the importance of preserving evidence and maintaining hope that future technology would provide answers that current science could not deliver. Young investigators in the audience listened to presentations about Jennifer's case, learning how meticulous evidence preservation and patient detective work had ultimately overcome seemingly impossible odds. Many left the ceremony inspired to apply similar dedication to their own unsolved cases. The COVID-19 pandemic of 2022-021 brought unexpected changes to many aspects of society, including the operation of police, laboratories, and court systems. However, work on cold cases continued, with Jennifer's case serving as inspiration for investigators who understood that justice delayed was not necessarily justice denied. Virtual court proceedings allowed retired investigators and witnesses to participate in cold case trials without traveling, expanding the pool of people who could contribute to solving decades-old crimes. Dr. Reeves, now in her 70s, testified via video link in cases across the country, sharing the expertise she had developed over decades of forensic work. The Wyant family adapted to pandemic restrictions by holding virtual memorial services that allowed friends and supporters from across the country to participate. The online format actually expanded their reach, connecting them with other families who had experienced similar losses and found strength in shared experiences. Technology that had seemed miraculous in 2005 when Young was convicted had become routine by 2020. Genetic genealogy, which combined DNA analysis with family tree research, was solving cases that even advanced forensic techniques could not crack. Jennifer's case had been part of the early wave of DNA successes that paved the way for even more sophisticated investigative tools. As 2025 approached, marking 45 years since Jennifer's death, her case continued to serve as a model for cold case investigations across the United States. Law enforcement academies used it as a teaching example, showing students how proper evidence preservation and advancing technology could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. The Wyant family had found peace in the knowledge that Jennifer's death had meaning beyond their personal loss. Her case had helped establish protocols for evidence preservation that had benefited thousands of other families. The scholarship established in her name had helped dozens of young people pursue their educational dreams. Jennifer's story had become part of the larger narrative about victims' rights and the importance of never giving up on unsolved cases. Victims' advocacy groups cited her case when arguing for increased funding for cold case investigations and improved laboratory capabilities. The neighborhood where Jennifer had lived in 1980 had changed dramatically over 4 decades, with new homes replacing older structures and different families moving into the area. But longtime residents still remembered the bright teenager whose death had shaken their sense of security and whose case had eventually demonstrated the power of persistence in scientific progress. The conclusion of Jennifer Wyant's story was not the happy ending that her family had hoped for in 1980, but it was an ending nonetheless. After decades of uncertainty, they had received answers to their questions and seen their daughter's killer held accountable for his actions. Their journey from tragedy to resolution had spanned nearly half a century, encompassing tremendous changes in forensic science, criminal investigation techniques, and society's understanding of victims' rights. Jennifer's case had been part of a revolution in law enforcement that had brought justice to thousands of families who might otherwise have waited forever for answers. The family's experience had taught them that healing was possible even after devastating loss, but that it required time, support, and ultimately, truth. The conviction of Johnnie Earl Young had not restored Jennifer to them, but it had allowed them to transform their grief into purpose and their loss into legacy. In the end, Jennifer Wyant's brief life had touched far more people than she could have imagined during her 14 years. Her death had been a tragedy that shattered her family and traumatized her community. But her story had also become a beacon of hope for others facing similar circumstances, proof that patience and persistence could eventually overcome even the most challenging obstacles to justice. The ultimate lesson of Jennifer's case was not about the technology that solved it or the legal proceedings that brought her killer to justice. It was about the enduring power of memory, the importance of never giving up hope, and the remarkable capacity of human beings to find meaning and purpose even in the face of unimaginable loss. Her family had waited 25 years for justice, but they had never stopped believing that someday, somehow, the truth would emerge. Their faith had been rewarded not with Jennifer's return, but with the knowledge that her killer could never harm another innocent person and that her death had contributed to a larger movement toward justice for all victims of violent crime. As the story of Jennifer Wyant entered its 5th decade, it remained a testament to the idea that some mysteries, no matter how cold they become, are never truly forgotten. In police files and family memories, in scientific laboratories and courtrooms, in memorial gardens and scholarship funds, Jennifer's presence continued to make a difference in the world she had left too soon. The bright, hopeful 14-year-old who had kissed her parents goodbye on a September evening in 1980 had become something larger than herself, a symbol of persistence, a catalyst for scientific advancement, and a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, justice and healing were possible. Her story would continue to inspire and instruct long after all who knew her personally had joined her in rest, ensuring that Jennifer Wyant's brief but meaningful life would never be forgotten.